All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our last lesson, our last assignment, our last video, I guess, in this unit. Once again, this is Unit 4. We're looking at the period 1450 to 1750, and we are still looking at the maritime empires. Today, we'll be looking at the economic effects. So we'll dive a little bit into money, and we'll look at the economies of all of these maritime empires that we have been studying. So at times it will get a little mathematical, at least a little bit, but it's important for us to understand the economic ideologies and also the economic realities of this time period. Let's go ahead and look at our essential questions. Our essential questions were: what are the various reasons Europeans established these maritime empires? And what are the various effects that these new interoceanic connections had on both the old and the new world? We've seen examples of effects on both old and new. Oftentimes, people so much focus on the effects of the new world, but there were a lot of effects on the old world as well. The last one is: what changes and continuities existed during this time period? We've already seen a few changes and continuities. For example, one big change that we saw earlier was the Portuguese entering into the Indian Ocean Exchange. Within that same idea, a continuity was that the Indian Ocean Exchange still existed and was still this marketplace in which a lot of trade occurred. Now, what we'll be doing at the end of our synchronous sessions is we'll be completing a chart comparing all the maritime empires. Remember, our three ways of reasoning and thinking about history are causation, comparison, and change in continuity over time. We'll be looking at comparison. Let's go ahead and begin. So if we remember from our last lesson, we went over the triangle or the triangular trade. We especially looked at this with the Middle Passage. Now, the Middle Passage was the bottom part of this trade here, as slaves were brought from West Africa to the Americas and the Caribbean and even Brazil, as we saw. And these raw materials, things like lumber and furs and rice and cotton and sugar, were brought all the way back to Europe. Not just England, although England, as we'll see in Unit 5, is one of the main producers of manufactured goods. What we'll be looking at today is this part of the triangular trade. We'll be looking at the manufactured goods and how Europe is going to greatly benefit off this triangular trade. Let's go into this idea of mercantilism. Now, if there's one word that you're going to get out of this lesson, it should be mercantilism, because this is the main economic theory at the time. So I've given you a definition here. It's an economic theory that trade generates wealth, which is finite. Stop. This is important here. There is this idea that there is a finite amount of wealth as opposed to an infinite amount of wealth. So, for example, if you were able to gather all the gold and silver, which is how wealth is measured at this time, if you get all the gold and silver in the world and put it in a pile, that's it. That is all the wealth that exists. You cannot produce any more wealth. If you were to divide that up amongst all of the countries, every country would get a little bit of gold and get a little bit of silver. However, we know that people are greedy. We know that countries want more. If you want more wealth, you must take it from another country. If you are going to get a bigger slice of the pie, that means someone else must get a smaller slice of the pie. And that is the mercantilist view. That is in direct contrast to the way that we view our economy today. We view economics as being infinite, as in the fact that we can generate more and more wealth, that the pile of gold that we might have in front of us is not all of the wealth in the world, and we can grow this pile of gold. We'll talk about that in later units. So how is it that mercantilism actually works? Well, I do have a few political cartoons here in order to help explain. First off, you're going to start with a lot of gold and silver. Gold and silver is how you measure wealth. Gold and silver is good. That's what people want. Now, the mother country. What's the mother country? The mother country is the country that is setting up colonies. So let's use the United States as an example. You know from seventh grade U.S. history that the United States started as the original 13 colonies. Those colonies are the sons and daughters, per se, of the mother country, which was England. So you have your mother country's treasury. They have a whole lot of money. Now, what this mother country wants to do is make even more money. How do you make more money? You export more than you import. Import is what you buy from other countries. You import it into your country. Export is what you sell to other countries. You sell it out of your country to them. You want to sell more than you buy. That's how you make money. And so your exports need to be more than your imports. So if you were a mother country, you want really, really cheap imports and you want really, really expensive exports, as is seen here. The colonies provide the raw materials, the gold, the silver, the fur, the lumber, the food, the whatever it is in order to create manufactured goods. The mother country sells these manufactured goods back to the colonies. If we look at this particular political cartoon, we see that the colonies are there to serve the mother country. That's the whole idea. The colonies are not there to build up wealth for themselves. They are there to build wealth for the mother country. The mother country is taking their slice of the pie, per se. This political cartoon does a great job at explaining this. So let's break this down. We have big bad mother country right here. We have the colonies right here. Now, the colonies are going to give these raw goods to the mother country. The mother country will pay them a little amount of money. The mother country has set up a trade system and laws that have been put into place in order to ensure that they can get imports at a very, very low price. Those laws are put into place to restrict trade in a certain way. Then the mother country puts them in their big machines, and out come manufactured goods. They sell these manufactured goods back to the colonies at a very high price, which is why all these money bags are behind the mother country there. So that's the process by which the mother country gains a whole lot of money and therefore power. You might sit there and you think, well, wait a second, couldn't they sell to someone else? When I say they, I mean the colonies. Couldn't the colonies just go and sell to a different country that's not the mother country? No, because the mother country has put in certain rules and laws. Trade and navigation acts are in place to prevent this from occurring, to prevent colonies from selling to other countries, other foreign markets. This is very much a restriction on trade, as opposed to what we see today is what we call free trade. Free trade is this idea that there are no restrictions on trade or minimal restrictions on trade, that every country can trade with every other country and can do so freely. For an example of this in class, think of the Indian Ocean Exchange back in Unit 2, back before the Portuguese showed up. The Indian Ocean Exchange, there weren't necessarily high taxes. There were not barriers to trade. There weren't laws and rules that were put into place in order to prevent one side from gaining a lot of money or in order to help another side really benefit from the trade. It was just an open, fair game. Whoever traded. If you got a lot of money, great. If you lost, you lost, and that's the way it was. There's still debates on whether we should have free trade or fair trade today. And so it's important to know these things and know the history behind trade and how trading has worked throughout the entirety of human history. Let's go ahead and move on because of all of this trade that is happening ever since Unit 2. So when I'm talking about the commercial and price revolution, I mean, yeah, I'm bringing it up in Unit 4, but it's really been in existence since Unit 2. The commercial revolution is this idea that trade should be used based on gold and silver. So the idea is that you buy goods directly. Think about the way that we buy goods today. I mean, you would not go to the store with your television and try to trade in order to get some food. That's not how we work in our society. But prior to the commercial revolution, it was. People didn't have money. You had goods. If you grew rice, you had rice, and you could trade it for corn or for horses or for whatever else you needed. It wasn't until this commercial revolution where you get pictures like this in which people actually spend money in order to buy goods. You also have the price revolution. Because there is an increase in the population and because there's an increase in the gold and silver, as we'll see in just a little bit closer to the end of this presentation here, prices are going to rise. So you have the commercial revolution, the price revolution. We're starting to get a society that looks more like our modern day society. Now we have to get into some of the businesses of this time period. The first one is joint stock companies. These joint stock companies are actually incredibly important, and some authors have put that the invention of joint stock companies is the reason why we have the world today. And they would say that this is actually the most important, invention in the history of the world. So here's how a joint stock company works. Let's use an example. Let's say I want to open a shoe store. I am passionate about selling shoes and I want to sell all types of shoes. It'll be Mr. Cernak's shoe store. That's what we'll call it. So what I would have to do in order to open that shoe store is I'm going to have to take out a loan because I'm going to have to pay for the building. I'm going to have to pay for the shoes. I'm going to have to pay for the electricity. I'm going to have to pay for a lot of things. And I don't have that type of money because I am a teacher. And so I'm going to need to take out a loan and I'm going to need to open up a shoe store. And then once I do that, then hopefully I can start making money so I can pay back my debts and pay off my loans, and then I can finally, start making a little bit of money, maybe 5 or 10 years down the road. That is incredibly risky. Here's why. The reason it's so risky is because if my shoe business doesn't work, let's say people hate Mr. Cernak's shoes, and I go out of business, not only do I lose all the money that I have, I still have to pay the bank my loan or my debt. So now I'm in debt, thousands, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands, however much money it was. And that's obviously horrible for me. So because that's so risky, I don't want to do that. I'm going to say, you know what? My dream was to open up a shoe store, but it's too risky. I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to stay here and remain a teacher. Well, that means it's almost impossible for a normal person to open up businesses. The only people who could open up businesses or possibly even start a colony would be people who are very, very rich, namely kings and queens. That would really be about it. Your common everyday person can't do that. But what if I involved all of you guys? I mean, I have almost 200 students. What if instead of getting a loan from the bank, I said, you know what? Everyone chip in a little bit of money. And I'm going to use this money and I'm going to open up a shoe store. Now, you might chip in some money. And the way I'm going to get you to do that is I promise you return of shares. I'm going to say, look, when you chip in money, you'll own this much of the company. And when we make a profit, I'll give you money back. So if you give me $100 right now, yeah, you might not see that $100 for a while, but when my company starts making profits and I get as big as Nike, you're going to start making way more than $100. I'm going to start giving you a ton of money because we are all sharing in these profits. This creates what we call a limited liability. This limited liability means that you can only lose the money that you put in. If we look at the previous example, I lost all my money and I was in debt. But if you give me $100 and this company, the Mr. Cernak shoe store, goes bankrupt and goes down and doesn't ever work and then never resurrects, well, you only lost $100. Yeah, that's rough, but it's not the end of the world. You're certainly not in debt. So these joint stock companies would bring people together, offer them returns on shares and a share of the profit, while also minimizing the risk that it would take in order to open a company. That is what is important here. The fact that this structure allows people to take a risk without taking too big of a risk and possibly gives them an incentive like a return on shares in order to get their money, in order to make a business or make a company that's going to do something that benefits people. That is how we get both of these companies, the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC, because that's the letters in Dutch, and the British East India Company. Now, the Dutch VOC is going to rule the spice trade in Indonesia, at least for a little bit. They're going to take their flutes, their big ships, and they're going to take them down to Indonesia. Think of those countries that are just to the north of Australia. Now, the last time we looked at those countries was actually in Unit 1. I guess we talked about them in Unit 2, but mainly Unit 1, where we talked about the Majapahit and the Srivijaya. We said if you control the trade, if you control the access to spices, you're going to have a whole lot of money. And that's what the Dutch do. So the big change is that it's not the Majapahit, it's not the Srivijaya, it's not the Muslim merchants, it's now the Dutch who are controlling that spice trade. But the continuity is that there's still a whole lot of money to be made off spices. The Dutch will go down there, they'll get those spices, bring them back to Europe, and they'll set up these massive trading centers as more and more people move into these urban areas, and they will be able to use those spices in order to gain wealth. This is how merchants are going to make their money. The British East India Company is actually going to do the same thing, but in India. They will take over parts of the Indian subcontinent and they will take over the cotton production there, and they will make sure to benefit from that. So cotton and spices. We'll also see that the British compete with the Dutch in the Spice Islands as well. But we'll see that in our reading when we actually get to our synchronous session. So I'll wait for that reading in order to give you more information on this competition in the Spice Islands between the Dutch and the British. We also see that in addition to joint stock ventures, there are government funded ventures. So the kings and queens are also going to fund governments. For example, the British king, the British royalty is going to have charters in Maryland and Virginia. So they are going to be the ones financing these colonies and these businesses in a way in Maryland and Virginia. We already saw that the king and queen of Spain and Portugal are also going to fund things. And they're going to fund these ventures. So Columbus was funded by Isabella and Ferdinand. Cortez was funded by the Spanish crown as well. We see that the Portuguese and Spanish, all of their colonies are always funded by the government, which is the king and the queen. For the British, that's not true. We're going to see that some are funded by the king and queen. Most of them will be funded by these joint stock ventures, which is part of the reason why the Industrial Revolution first begins in Britain. But we'll discuss that more in Unit 5. There it is. Okay, now we need to get to a part that's a little bit more confusing. This is New World Silver. Okay, and this is the big map that's here as well. I'll take my time and go slowly with this because it is a little bit confusing, or at least to me, it's a little bit confusing. Let's start with the basics. We know the Spanish are in South America. Boom, right there, there it is. We know that they use natives in order to work on the land. We saw that with the encomienda and the hacienda systems. Okay, now we need to talk about something specific. There's a city called Potosi in Bolivia, and this city has a mine in it, and this mine has a whole lot of silver. Now, once the Spanish are able to find out how to extract that silver, this has impacts for the entire world. And that's why this is confusing because it impacts the whole world in a in slightly different ways. When we talk about global trade today, the first instance of real global trade that included both the old and new world is through this new world silver here. Now, 80% of this global silver is going to be from the new world, from this spot right here. It will go in one of two directions. The silver will either flow back to Europe right over here, or it will flow this way and all the way around to China. Let's go ahead and actually talk about the Japanese as well, and then we'll talk about the effects of this. So we'll also see that there's silver going from Japan to China. So what we'll see is that Japan and China don't get along well, and they don't really want to trade with one another, at least not directly. This makes an opportunity for a middleman. If there's something that you get from this, just know that the middlemen always win. Okay, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is up to you, but the middlemen are always the winners. The Portuguese say, hey, we'll take the silver. And so the Portuguese are going to go from Japan. They will pick up the silver. They'll take it to China. They'll buy a bunch of Chinese silk and a bunch of Chinese porcelain. They'll take it back to Japan and they will sell that silk and they'll sell that porcelain and they'll make a profit every single time. Now, it might only be a little profit on the silk and the porcelain, but if you do that hundreds of thousands of times, that's going to add up, which is why middlemen make a whole lot of money. People who are middlemen only make this much money on each transaction, but each transaction happens hundreds of thousands of millions of times, and all of that money adds up. Okay, now that we've established our core basics there, let's talk about the impacts. This is where it gets a little bit confusing. First thing, let's talk about the New World. So we see a continuation of the exploitation of natives. We still see coerced labor in South America done by the Spanish against the natives. That silver is taken to Europe, as we saw in the map here. So it's taken to Europe. What happens is that these European merchants are going to take this silver over to China. Once they get to China, they're going to use that silver to buy luxury goods. Think silk and porcelain, as we've talked about again and again throughout this class. They will bring that silk and porcelain back to Europe and they'll sell that silk and porcelain. They'll mark up the price a little bit so that way they can get a return on their investment. So this is the trade that's occurring. So we see a continuity in the fact that we still have the Silk Road between Europe and China. The difference is that Europe has a lot more silver. Now, all of Europe is acting as the middleman. And we said that the middleman is the one who wins. So these middlemen, these merchants, they're going to make a ton of money. However, there are other people who are going to be losers. After all, if you have winners, you have to have losers. Who are the losers? Well, the losers are going to be the Ming Dynasty. Now, in Unit 3, I talked about how the Ming Dynasty collapsed and fell in 1644. And I partially say it's because they had to pay their taxes in silver. Here's how that process works. So, people have to pay their taxes in silver, which means they have to do something that allows them to get silver. If you grow grain and you grow rice, you might not get silver in return, especially if that silver is coming from Europe. Are Europeans going to buy a lot of grains? Are they going to buy a lot of rice? Probably not. What are they going to spend their silver on? They're going to spend it on silk. And so you have a lot of individuals start to go into the silk business because, that's how you're going to make silver and that's how you're going to make your taxes. This means that more and more people in Ming China are producing silk. Now, here's some basic economic theories here. Whenever you have competition, prices go down. Prices going down is great for consumers, namely those European merchants. They're like, this is great. This is wonderful. Prices are low. That means we can buy more, we can mark them up a little bit and make even more money. But that's horrible if you own a silk business. If you have to lower your prices, that means you don't make as much money. So now you're not making as much silver because you have all of this competition. But in addition to that, the government is still begging you to give them taxes for a couple different reasons. The government of the Ming Dynasty is going to spend money to build the Great Wall of China, or rebuild the Great Wall of China to defend themselves from the Manchus. Remember, in Unit 3, we went over the Qing Dynasty. We said that they were ethnically Manchu. They come from the north of China. The Ming Dynasty is worried about that. The Ming Dynasty was also worried about the Mongol Empire. I mean, they remembered that. They studied history. They knew that invaders from the north had come in and set up the Yuan Dynasty. They certainly don't want that again, so they have to defend their borders, which is part of Conrad DeMar's model part 4, as we discussed all the way back in Unit 1. But in addition to that, the rich and wealthy people of the Ming Dynasty had gotten used to a certain way of life. They had gotten used to the government paying for things or giving them tax breaks in certain situations. And so the Ming Dynasty had to continue to pay for those things. Now, as more and more silver came in, there was inflation. Because of inflation, this silver is worth less than it was before, which means the government has to take more in taxes from the people. And so the people don't have as much money because they're getting hurt because they can't raise their prices, and they're getting hurt because the government is squeezing more and more money out of them. So people are poor. In addition to this, because so many people went into the silk industry, there are fewer people growing food. And when there's less food, people can't eat. And when people can't eat, they get really, really mad. In addition to there being less people growing food, or fewer people growing food, you also have the Little Ice Age. I briefly mentioned the Little Ice Age before, but the Little Ice Age was between the 13th and 18th centuries, in which the global temperatures came down a degree or two. Now, while that doesn't seem like a huge deal, like it's only a degree or two, it has catastrophic consequences on the environment and on the production of food. Because it's colder, there's less crop production. So now there's less money for the people and there's less food for the people. This leads to a massive rebellion against the Ming Dynasty, which is why the Ming Dynasty collapses in 1644, which leads to the Qing Dynasty. We also have other losers in Europe. So we saw that the European merchants were winning. Those who went to China, got the silk and porcelain and brought it back and sold it at an upmarked price, they were winning. They got a whole lot of money. But we also see that there are losers in Europe, mainly those who live in these massive trading centers and have local businesses. For example, if you're a local business in Europe and you sell silk, you are not going to be able to compete with the low prices in China. Those merchants are going to come back from China. They're going to undersell you. Their silk is going to be cheaper and it's going to be just as good as the silk you had. So now you are unable to sell your silk to the people. And because you can't take in a profit, you have to close down your local businesses. This is the first time, as I said earlier, that we really get this globalized trade that connects the Americas to Europe to Asia. We see the Americas lose because because they get their silver taken from them. The Asian people of Asia lose, especially the Chinese, because of inflation and because of taxes and all those things I just described. But the European merchants win because they are the middlemen. The same thing happens with Japan and the Philippines to China. Japan and the Philippines are going to trade their silver to the Portuguese in order to give to China. So the Portuguese can buy silk and porcelain from China and bring it back to Japan and the Philippines. So we see that the Portuguese, the English, the Dutch, if you were a middleman, if you had a ship and you transferred this silver and transferred these goods, you were winning. You got a whole lot of money. Everyone else is a loser. Now, why does this matter? Why spend so much time on this? Think back to what we talked about in Unit 2. In Unit 2, we talked about globalization, and a majority of us said globalization is a good thing. We saw all of the advantages of trade routes. We saw that it produced wealth, it spread religion, it created synchronized languages, and we all said, hey, globalization seems really cool. But in the last couple of units, we've seen the more negative impacts on globalism, and we've seen people start to turn towards nationalism. We saw in Unit 3 that China started to close its door off to the rest of the world. We saw this with the Ming Dynasty canceling the voyages of Zheng He. We also saw the Qianlong Emperor of the Qing Dynasty start to close the ports, or at least not open the ports up to the English. We also saw the Japanese close off their doors once they had the Tokugawa shogunate. This isn't necessary. This does not come from a racist or almost a xenophobic place. Where this comes from is for a protection of both culture and the economy. As we see, when you expand trade and you allow for globalized trade, yes, it helps middlemen, yes, it helps consumers, but it really hurts local businesses and it really can hurt local culture as you get more and more diversity in there. So there are all of these problems with globalism as well that we need to address in our society today. To really bring this up to the modern day, think Amazon. Now, when Amazon first started and before it started producing all of its own things, it acted as a middleman. That's all it was. It connected you, the consumer, to someone else, the producer of goods. And what it allowed people to do is lower the price of their goods, which was great for the consumer and great for the middleman because Amazon took a cut of it every single time. And you, the consumer, you had cheap goods that were delivered to your home. But this destroyed local businesses because these local businesses could never keep up with a behemoth, a huge company like Amazon, and many of these local businesses had to shut their doors. So you, as a future voter in the United States of America, you need to look back at history and you need to think about what should the United States do moving forward? Should the United States continue to engage in globalized trade, which is going to help middlemen and help the consumers? Or should the United States start to turn inward and be more nationalist and protect its local industries in order to ensure people have the job? I'm not going to be able to answer that question. I'm a high school teacher. I'm not an economics major. I am not working in the White House, but you, as future voters of America, can answer that question by using your vote. And it's important to keep that in mind. It's important to have good historical knowledge so that way you can make informed decisions as an American and as a global citizen. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll go ahead and get off my soapbox there because we're getting a little emotional with all that talk about America. I'll go ahead and end this lecture here, but please make sure you bring your notes to our synchronous learning session. That way you can use them in order to engage in our activity that we'll be doing in class.